And then it's the usability person like watching, getting ready for them to put the shapes in, and all the shapes just fit in one hole. So they just put them all in that one hole. And so usability testing is critical because you need to see like people will do that.
All right, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're going to have a pretty focused conversation today, pretty narrow, set narrower than probably our usual conversation, but there's some gems in here, especially at the outset of your project. Today, we're going to talk about user research. So asking the right questions so that we build the right things. You probably know that this is a subject matter that is near and dear to Emily's heart. You'll be hearing a lot of Emily's voice today. Todd and Derek aren't here, so the rest of us will sing harmony. And the overall agenda, like,
do-wop. Okay, sorry.
Julie is the harmonization leader in the clubhouse, I would think. So
as we well know from our karaoke dates.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so a quick overview of research, kind of what it is and why it is, and then talking about user research and how we use it to execute projects, ensure we build the right thing, et cetera. And we picked one specific scenario. We'll talk about other scenarios and how that applies once we get those broad principles down. So Em, you want to start?
Absolutely. So just starting us with a definition and thought around why would we do any user research? And there's a lot of conversation in the Microsoft 365 world now, especially around employee experience. And if we care so much about the people that we're building these items for, it's really important that we understand where they're coming from, what they need, and what their behaviors are. So user research is really focused on understanding those user behaviors, needs, motivations, and we do that through observation, task analysis, and some other ways of gathering feedback. Now, of course, classic consulting answer, the type of user research you'll do will depend on a lot of different things. So it'll depend on what you're building, what kind of site, system, or app you're designing, where you are in the process, your timeline, your environment, your budget. So we're going to start with a couple high-level resources that give you an overview of what's available to you in the user research landscape, and then we'll start to drill down into some specifics.
So let's talk about that menu of options available to you.
This is one of my favorite resources from Nielsen Norman Group. They are the world leaders in user research. So this session is essentially a highlight of all of their incredible resources. They're on every single slide, and we have a lot of them at the end as well. This is a great place to start. This article created a graph of essentially qualitative versus quantitative methods, as well as attitudinal versus behavioral. So you can look here at all of the different user research methods, see what they're measuring, and line that up with what you're trying to learn. Now, qualitative versus quantitative, just a quick reminder, qualitative, that's usually non-numerical data. We can have a lower number of participants in that. We can have about 4 to 6 participants. When we have quantitative, because we're looking for things that are statistically relevant, we do need a lot higher number of involvement. So typically that's where we have more than 20 people. And then of course, attitudinal versus behavioral is also really important because we want to know what people think about the solution, but we also want to know how they interact with the solution. And sometimes those two items are different from each other.
Now, the key, Emily, here, the word product means the thing that you are doing research on. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
So we'll talk a little bit more about what we should measure in a couple of slides, but my spoiler is if you have the budget for it and time, everything. So when we say product, a lot of Nielsen Norman Group's language is around, creation of new applications starting from scratch. So you just kind of have to take that with a grain of salt as we're applying it to what we're doing in Microsoft 365. And we'll be doing that today as we talk through a use case where we're not starting from scratch.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
I think you also have to sort of be realistic about the constraints that you have. So for example, if you've got a chief marketing officer who says everything has to have this red and it's got to be in this position, and you can't control that, then don't do testing that's going to tell you that that's not the right answer. It would just be a waste of time. So make sure that you're picking your methods based on the reality of your organization as well as what you're trying to decide.
And the reality of the platform.
Yep.
Yeah, I don't do testing on the functionality of an out-of-the-box web part. I trust that Microsoft has invested a lot of time and money into creating those web parts. Now, would I do user testing on how I'm using that web part and how people consume the content that it's surfacing? Sure, but there is a little bit of a nuance there. So on our next slide, essentially what we're talking about at a very high and removed level is this idea of a user-centered design process. So usability.gov has this map. If you click that link at the bottom, you can actually click on any of these yellow tiles to learn more about each step. Overall, this is generally the way that I run any of our site builds, for example, when we're building an intranet, and we tend to go through these different steps. So you can see in design, for example, when we're talking about site requirements, we'll talk about that a little bit today. And then we have people look at what their content is. We start to define the IA, then we drop the content in. So a lot of this will likely align and seem familiar with the way you are running your projects as well. Now, another piece from usability.gov that is helpful that you can combine with that first graph from Nielsen Norman Group is they list out all of these different user research methods. And then you can see in the table, they tell you whether you can use that method to measure knowing your user, evaluating the content, evaluating the design, or doing a test and refine. So you can see some of them will say yes all the way across, while others are really only for specific use cases. So for example, first click testing is not really going to help you get to know your users better. So if you're trying to understand what they're coming to your intranet for, probably not the best user research method.
Mark in the chat noted that usability.gov, the site is archived and it's now digital.gov, but the links will still work, so it's all good.
Thank you,
One of the
Mark.
things about that slide before, Emily, it makes it look like it's this beautiful linear process, right? You just sort of march along there and everything just happens. There's a lot of looping back and around and forward. You're right. I mean, I think the reality is that we have to sort of gauge based on what we're doing.
Yeah, and I think we see that the most in the test and refine portion as well, towards the end. So something we've been circling around a little bit, how do I prioritize what to test? So these are typically the questions that I will think through before I recommend it to a client. So we want to evaluate what's risky, what is the greatest benefit, what has the greatest impact on that user task success. Because remember, we're building intranets or these solutions to reduce that gulf of execution to help your colleagues get their job done. So what's most important for helping them get their job done? And then also what feasibly can we make changes to? So earlier we were talking about if there's an out-of-the-box web part and we don't want to build custom web parts, I'm not going to necessarily test one of those features if that's going to be out of scope. Now, whenever we have those recommendations of things that we should do research on, I recommend putting it into an effort versus impact matrix so you can kind of see where it lands on maybe where your high priorities are.
Good visualization.
Emily, that feasibility one, I think we've run into a lot of times where large organizations will work with a design agency to develop some designs, and the designs have things like image maps in them, et cetera, which are lovely, but don't don't exist in modern SharePoint unless, Julie, unless they have since we talked about it last. So there's a lot of things like that where that SharePoint, that domain specific expertise around SharePoint helps you understand what's feasible here, right?
Absolutely.
What if we don't have any money to do user research?
We just skip it, right? We just don't do that.
So my best argument, sorry, Mark, to cut you off.
No, after you.
Before we go through our bullets, is that if you don't do it, you're likely going to be spending money later solving problems because you didn't do it. So the truth is you do have the budget, and you can right size it and keep it small so it's proportional.
Yeah, I think in this context, we're talking about user research, but in general, if you're not working with your users as you're building anything, including a house or a sandbox, like a literal sandbox where your kids are going to play, you're going to end up with something that nobody wants. And so make sure that you're always building with people, not for people. You have to be connected to those end users. So otherwise you're going to solve the wrong problems. You're going to build something that doesn't meet the need. You're going to end up with a lot of rework. You're going to have to, oh, we thought you would really like it if it did this. And that was the part that was really hard, and no one cares about that and needs it to work a different way. There's often a misconception that if you build something like an intranet, that people will just show up. That if you build it, they will come, and that's just not the case if you're not building it in such a way that it makes sense to people, but also that you have the right content, and your user research will help you understand the priorities of that content. Which is incredibly important. So more time for break fix, less likelihood of innovation, because if you're not talking to your users along the way, if you're not doing research, you're not getting those little nuggets of somebody saying, if you just did it this way, I'll bet that this would make a lot more sense to people, or it would be a lot quicker for me to get there if you did X, Y, and Z. That's innovation, and you want to make sure that you can take advantage of that.
So all that being said, we got a 1,000-hour project. We think there's probably 100 hours worth of user research that needs to be done. We didn't get budget for it. We got budget for 40, or we got budget for 20. Let's talk about what are the options to do more, not necessarily more, but as much as we can with less, because these user research topics, as they're all laid out, there's a huge menu of those, and there's something to fit kind of at everywhere along the line. So what if there is no time or budget?
So this does happen a lot, and thankfully there are a lot of resources out there from other user research that's been done on really large scales. And the good news is we all use systems in all aspects of our life, not just the ones we're using at work. So there are a lot of studies and design patterns with recommendations that you can follow. So if you align with other systems, that it's likely you're following patterns that have already been tested and proven to work. For example, when we are shopping online, it's most common that we see the filters along that left side of our screen. So if you put your filters there, it's going to be pretty normal behavior for someone to go over there and start to use them. If you put your filters at the bottom of the page below the results, unlikely someone's going to find it. You're introducing a new format. It'll cause some confusion and doesn't necessarily even make sense for how people would be consuming that content. So you can use the user experience heuristics and the design of other systems to guide those better practices of what you want to implement.
I like your next bullet about connecting with a representative for end users. I think I see that a lot, especially in development where an extensibility project might exist, but there's a lot, in it that's sourced by maybe IT organization, and they want to be the representatives of the end users and don't want to have to bother the end users. I think the problem with that becomes those people being representatives for end users when they don't fully use, they're not really involved in the day-to-day activity, and they don't really use that tool that we're trying to create an automation for or build an extensibility for. And then you end up with the wrong set of requirements. And I think that's a disservice to those end users. If you're going to pick a representative for the end users, it better be one of the end users, somebody who actually uses the thing that you are trying to get user research on at some level. I mean, it's maybe not user research anymore, but at least that representative needs to be a true representative, not a proxy. And I think that's a big difference in what you end up with in the end.
I was thinking, Julie, there's kind of a continuum of, at the far left, there's like, here's our requirements document, build to this. And you can't ask a document questions, right?
Yep.
You can't get clarifications on that. And then there's a proxy after that. So a business analyst or somebody who's assigned to represent the end users. And that's a little better, but it's still not great. And then there's direct conversation and engagement with the people who are going to use the system. which is better yet. And then there's iterative conversation with them. How about now? Is this better or worse? I think there's kind of a continuum that we could lay out there as well. Does that make sense to you, Emily? Have you seen things like that in the Nielsen-Norman research?
I mean, somewhat. I know we had this debate in our pre-planning, right, of what Julie's recommending is if you're talking to one of the end users, technically that is user research. It's just very, very low, right? Talking to one person is better than talking to no people, for sure. Typically in Nielsen-Norman Group resources, they talk about the lowest number, and depending on your type of research, usually that's around 5 for something like usability testing, and that can help you find 85% of the errors. So, you know, talking to nobody is off the spectrum of user research, right?
Yeah, I think we're talking to, I think we're using term, and it's good to define terms, right? Because what you mean by user research is maybe not what I've traditionally defined it as, and that may be part of the problem. I think what I more mean is requirements gathering, which is kind of a different thing than user research. Like it's has a different definition. And so I think that is maybe where some of the confusion can come in. If you are not really deep in this, like you are, the term user research is like, oh, you mean requirements gathering, when that's not actually what that word means at all in its, you know, formal definition. And so that's maybe a different thing. And then, so back to Mike's comment about this continuum thing, I guess what I more was talking about was user requirements gathering and having that proxy, because I mean, maybe it's not traditional or typical, but as a developer, I'll start working on something and start developing something based on a set of user requirements. And then I'm like, how's that going to work? That doesn't seem to make sense while I'm actually coding it. And then have these roundabout questions that I need to go, you do realize that this is not going to work maybe how we've spec'd it out, and we should re-talk about that. So that's that more iterative thing, but it's really requirements gathering and not user research. And so it's probably good to change or to elaborate that there's two definitions there and they're different.
That's a great distinction. Yeah.
Really good point, Julie.
Could we tackle Mark's question a little bit? Because I think there's a great question there about a commercial off-the-shelf based services versus custom. I think, Emily, some of what we do with Art of the Possible highlights this, right? Like, here are capabilities that you might not know that you have that you get out of the box with the platform. And let's talk about mapping your workflow to that. But does anybody want to tackle Mark's question in the comments?
I think you have to apply the same principles, whether it's COTS or from scratch, right? I mean, you're just starting at a different point. You know, how you customize something should be dependent on user research, in the same way that how you build something should be based on user research, or how you finish building something should be based on user research. I'm not sure it gives you a buy, in other words.
I think if you're doing custom development or custom extensibility, if you have something, if you're starting with something that's already been done, whether it be a configuration out of the box or not, that's where, as Emily is defining it, real user research would be super helpful to inform the requirements specification of the new implementation of that thing, right? So if you do true user research with the minimums and all of the things that Emily has been describing, then you understand that, hey, that thing, that piece of it, that, you know, this thing that we thought was a big problem, they're not even using, or they're not being able to do certain things because that feature doesn't exist. And you get that out of doing that user research. Then you can take all that user research and use that to create user requirements. So I think they're two separate. Back to sort of the thing I said before, is that where we were using those terms to mean the same thing when they're really, one thing leads to the other thing in the custom software realm. Anyway.
Anything else on when there's no time or budget for user research? What are our options? What's the least painful of these options?
I think that last bullet and its little 3 things below were mine, and I don't need to dwell on it. But, you know, sort of hiding behind, I don't have the budget, is sort of lame in my book. You know, you can do something. Just have lunch with people. You know, hop on a screen share and show them what you're doing. There are ways to interact with your end users that don't really cost anything and don't necessarily take a lot of time. They're not a replacement for real user research, but like Emily said, you know, talking to one person is better than talking to no people. So at least try to have touch points with your end users.
Shall we proceed?
Mm.
So we're just going to walk through a use case with some user research, and we're talking about migrating from Classic to modern SharePoint Online. So we already have an intranet in Classic, and now we want to change that structure and move into modern. So what should we do? In that first graph that I showed you from Nielsen Norman Group, lower in that article is this item where it talks about the different product development stages. And because we're going from something that exists, we're looking at strategize and design at the same time, right? Because we align with both of those research goals. When we're moving to modern, we have the opportunity for new directions and new solutions that we didn't have before. But we're also iterating on something, so we're trying to improve the usability of this existing design that we already have, and of course the existing design of what Microsoft provides us for us to work with. So we're going to walk through a couple of different stages. So where to begin? Very commonly, people will start with looking at the analytics, and this is a small portion of your story. Finding out in your out-of-the-box page analytics how many times someone has gone to a page or how frequently it's viewed gives you a portion of the story. Are people going there all of the time because it's a confusing process and it's not well written, so they have to continually go back to that page? Is the page not being viewed because it's not findable? Are there search and navigation issues to get someone to that content? So very often we want to look a little bit past just what we get in those analytics and make sure we start having conversations. So two of the ways that we'll have conversations before we begin, one is in user interviews. So you're finding out that qualitative opinion and those attitudes of people. And because they're one-on-one, you have the opportunity to dig deeper into a thread when someone brings something up. But then we also want to combine that and make sure that we have a good view across the whole organization, what people think and feel about the intranet. So we also will include a survey to get that quantitative data. But again, both of those are just attitudinal. So similar to leaving a Yelp review, I will admit I've only left them when I've been frustrated. I haven't left a ton of ones when I've been happy. So you might have a total skew in your survey, for example, because maybe people are only going to complete it if they're feeling frustrated and unhappy. And that's just their attitude about it. Doesn't mean that their behaviors change. They might be still using the intranet. So sometimes we also want to look at things like usability testing. So if you have some of your top tasks and you know what your intranet was built for, this gives you the opportunity to set a baseline of how long does it take for people to complete these tasks? Are they able to complete these tasks? And how are they going about getting there? Are they using navigation? Are they using search? Are they using personal bookmarks? And understanding that behavior set will help you design a solution better for how they're already working.
That's like watching somebody, helping somebody write code. Okay, yeah, sure, you could do it that way.
I mean, have you even seen that video on Twitter? It was from a couple weeks ago. It's that kid's toy that has it's a cube and it has like the triangle, the star, whatever. And then it's the usability person like watching, getting ready for them to put the shapes in, and all the shapes just fit in one hole. So they just put them all in that one hole. And so usability testing is critical because you need to see, like, people will do that. It's not because they're lazy. It's they're going to do what's easy and efficient. So let's set it up that way for them so they match them correctly, hopefully.
Yes, exactly. We have a question from Krista. Do you have a recommendation for SharePoint compatible analytics program software that can provide high level traffic, i.e. above and beyond individual site usage info for separate sites? Whew.
I think Mike does.
Mike,
Yeah.
do you have a recommendation? I can tell you there's an extensibility answer there, but do we have some people?
I'd look most closely at tyGraph and Cardiolog as kind of the two premier ISV solutions for analytics in SharePoint. I have more hands-on experience with tyGraph, more personal experience with them. I think they're a great organization. They were recently purchased by AvePoint, which will change things as well. But yep, Sean, I see you're using Cardiolog. They seem to have a really great offering. I just don't have any hands-on experience with it myself.
Some people do roll their own too with the audit log, exports from the audit log as the fodder for it, which is sort of what those products end up doing. But
yeah, or what Julie was alluding to as well, with just adding App Insights to the pages and rolling your own that way.
Yeah.
Yep. An extensibility solution. It's not a hard one either. It's actually a pretty low. You just have to be okay with that, like adding that. But it's very simple, actually.
Quick 5-minute warning, by the way.
Yeah, we're going to go quick just to get our next couple slides in. So during the project, blurs the line a little bit even more between the requirements gathering user research conversation that we were having a couple slides before with Julie. I recommend starting anything you build ever, out of the box or custom, with these user needs statements. So this idea that we're defining who's coming to the site, what do they need to do, and what's the goal they're trying to achieve. Mark also commented on this in the chat, that what we're really focusing on is we're building for specific outcomes. What are the outcomes that we're trying to get, and making sure that we stay focused on that. And this is a great opportunity when you are doing that requirements gathering, if you don't have user research, to remind the people that you're working with that there's a variety of types of users. There's the people who are maintaining it, right? You have your site owners, for example, but then you have your site consumers as well. And you have managers, you have individual contributors. Everyone at the organization will interact with the content a little bit differently depending on their role.
Builds.
I broke my promise, Mike. There was a build. My apology.
It was beautiful.
And then during the project, so again, we have those user need statements for anything you're doing. Very often when I'm doing navigation, I'll do card sorting, whether that's open or closed. So whether I offer to people those categories to put the cards into, or whether I give them blank cards to create their own, and tree testing. So that way we can really measure if that is intuitive and giving strong enough information sent. And then sometimes we run into situations where there might be a lot of debate on the internal team of which way is the best to go forward. I highly recommend A/B testing, so you can actually just compare those two and get specific data about whether people can reach those outcomes. Now, towards the end of the project, this is where you can grab those user needs statements you made at the beginning, turn them into usability testing tasks, whether you do remote moderated or unmoderated, so you can actually measure, this is what we set out to do, and did we achieve that? And then, of course, after a big launch, you can again also do that option for surveys to make sure you're getting feedback from everybody. And again, usually you'll get some of the more unhappy people, but that is still important to know where your outliers are, and then you as a team can evaluate how relevant that feedback is. Is it one cranky person who doesn't like change, or is this a really good point that we didn't consider during our project process? Now, that was a very fast walkthrough of doing user research from classic to modern. So just to talk about some other scenarios, I'm an advocate for user research always. So if you're not asking people, then you're not going to know. We're just making really, really good guesses. Most commonly, though, we do see user research be prioritized when we're doing migrations or modernization, custom solutions, and then things like search improvement. So for example, if you are working on a search improvement, it's really important to know, well, how many people are using the search and how are they using it? Or are people just consuming the content through navigation?
There's a whole giant list of resources here, but Emily, are there some favorites here that you go back to time and again that you'd recommend to folks?
I like to think of the first one, when to use which user experience research method, as my giant awesome cookbook, and I can pick out my recipe that applies to whatever party I'm throwing that day. And then all of the other ones as they go down the page just match what we had throughout the slides for those different types of methods. So I recommend looking at that first one, picking out some that you think you want to do, and then diving into learning more the specifics about them.
This is a great page of links.
All right, we were at the top of the hour. We know that was kind of a whirlwind. There was a lot going on in the chat this week. Thank you for that. next 2 weeks from today, the week after Thanksgiving, we're going to be talking about your video content and the transition from Stream Classic to native video in SharePoint.
Nice.
So a couple of us are going to be on the road between now and then. If anybody's headed to ESPC, look for the Sympraxians there, or listen to Julie and AC talk Cloud Dev Clarity podcast.
Awesome.
Thanks everybody for joining us. Appreciate
Thanks,
it,
all.
Emily. Thank you
Great.
for all the work on this.
Thank you so much for joining us this week on Ask Sympraxis. We love getting your questions or session ideas. You can submit by using the link in About. If you find this helpful, hit that like or subscribe button and share this content with your colleagues. Join us again as we release new content every other Wednesday.